Welcome back to LoreEnce, where we excavate the truths that game worlds bury beneath their surfaces. In our previous investigations of Arc Raiders, we've looked upward at the machines that reign from orbital darkness, outward at the ruins being systematically reclaimed by forces we don't fully understand. We've analyzed invasion patterns, examined terraforming theories, dissected the cassette futurism aesthetic that defines this world's stalled technological progress. But today, we need to turn our attention inward. We need to descend past the airlocks, through the tube networks, into the claustrophobic corridors of Speranza itself. Because the greatest threat to humanity's survival might not be the sentinels patrolling the Rust Belt, or the leapers that hunt through abandoned hydroponic domes. The greatest threat might be what's happening to the people hiding beneath the surface, the slow transformation of human society under pressures that have no historical precedent. We assume because humans are survivors that they must be united. We imagine the underground settlements as bastions of cooperation, humanity finally learning the lessons that led to the collapse, standing shoulder to shoulder against extinction. But the environmental storytelling scattered throughout Arc Raiders paints a very different picture. It reveals a society fracturing under generational trauma, organized around economics of desperation, governed by tribal loyalties that make cooperation nearly impossible. Today we're investigating the sociology of apocalypse. We'll examine the contradas, the guild-like factions that divide Speranza into competing fiefdoms. We'll analyze what Celeste's seed economy reveals about the actual value of human life underground. We'll explore the tragedy of the darkborn generation, children raised in perpetual night who will inherit a world more depleted than the one their parents struggled to preserve. And we'll confront the uncomfortable possibility that Speranza isn't a refuge at all, but a prison we've built for ourselves. Walls constructed not from concrete and steel, but from fear and suspicion and the corrosive effects of permanent scarcity. The machines above are terraforming Earth's surface, but the darkness below is terraforming us, reshaping human nature in ways we might not recognize until the transformation is complete and irreversible. Let's begin our descent. The myth of unified resistance. When we think about post-apocalyptic survival, we carry certain assumptions shaped by decades of fiction. We imagine scrappy bands of survivors united by common purpose, humanity finally transcending the petty divisions that characterized pre-catastrophe society. The alien invasion or zombie outbreak or nuclear winter becomes a great equalizer, forcing cooperation through shared existential threat. Arc Raiders systematically deconstructs this comfortable mythology. Yes, there was a moment of unity. The Battle of Victory Ridge stands in Raider memory as humanity's finest hour. Scattered groups coordinating under Major Eva's leadership to achieve what seemed impossible against first-wave machines. For several days across rocky terrain west of Alcantara Dam, humans fought with unified purpose. They shared resources, covered each other's positions, sacrificed individual advantage for collective survival. And they won, driving back machines that had seemed invincible, proving that coordination could overcome technological disadvantage. But look at what happened immediately after that triumph. The victory didn't inaugurate a new era of human cooperation. Instead, survivors blamed each other for tactical failures that had cost lives. They feuded over spoils of war, arguing about who deserved what salvage from destroyed machines. They fractured the unity that had made victory possible, splintering back into competing groups defined by pre-existing loyalties and suspicions that brief cooperation had merely suspended rather than dissolved. Major Eva's patch, found decades later under the broken highway at Victory Ridge, represents more than one person's death. It symbolizes the death of unified human resistance, the moment when humanity's greatest organizational achievement collapsed back into the tribalism that defines underground life. That fracture never healed. It calcified into permanent social structure. Today's Speranza isn't governed by any unified command structure or democratic council. There's no mayor, no military hierarchy, no civic institutions that could claim legitimate authority over the settlement as a whole. Instead, Speranza is defined by contradas, guild-like factions that control specific resources or territories within the underground complex. These aren't just social clubs or mutual aid societies. They're essentially competing power centers, each looking after their own members while viewing outsiders with suspicion or outright hostility. This isn't cooperation, it's tribalism, wearing the mask of social organization. When you walk through Speranza's tunnels, you're not witnessing functional government. You're seeing a collection of gangs that have achieved uncomfortable equilibrium, each strong enough to defend their turf but not strong enough to dominate rivals, locked in a Cold War where open conflict would destroy everyone but cooperation remains perpetually out of reach. The implications are devastating for humanity's long-term survival prospects. Resources that could be pooled for common benefit are instead hoarded by individual contradas. Knowledge that could be shared to improve everyone's capabilities is instead kept secret to maintain competitive advantage. Raiders who could coordinate operations topside instead compete and sometimes betray each other because their primary loyalty is to their contrada, not to humanity as an abstraction. This context completely reframes what we see during extraction gameplay. When raiders from the same settlement betray each other over loot. When squads compete for the same resources rather than coordinating. When trust between human survivors proves more fragile than the temporary alliances raiders sometimes form with strangers encountered topside. We're not witnessing game mechanics encouraging player conflict. We're seeing accurate representation of canonical social reality. The game explicitly acknowledges this. Raiders from the same settlement sometimes betray each other topside. Survival instincts override social bonds when resources are scarce and death is permanent. This isn't failure of human morality, it's adaptation to circumstances where individual survival and contrada loyalty must take precedence over abstract ideals about human unity. Consider what this means for military effectiveness against arc machines. Humanity won the Battle of Victory Ridge through coordination, but that coordination required exceptional leadership from Major Ava and extraordinary circumstances that temporarily suspended normal competitive dynamics. Without similar leadership and circumstances, raiders operate as competing individualists or small tribal groups rather than as unified resistance force. This explains why humanity hasn't reclaimed any surface territory despite decades of experience fighting machines. It's not just that second wave machines are more sophisticated than first wave units, though that's certainly true. It's that human organizational capacity has actually regressed since Victory Ridge. The survivors who united to win that battle were closer to pre-collapse civilization, still carrying memory of how large-scale cooperation functions. Current raiders are further removed from those memories, raised in contrada system where tribalism is normal and cooperation beyond small groups is aberration. We're too busy fighting Cold War with our neighbors to effectively fight hot war with machines. The veteran raider problem intensifies this organizational failure. Combat experience against arc machines is accumulated individually through repeated survival of the high-risk encounters. The raiders who live long enough to become genuinely skilled are the ones who have learned when to avoid fights, when to flee, when to let other raiders take risks while they preserve themselves. These aren't cowards. They're pragmatists who understand that dying heroically serves no purpose when resurrection is impossible. But this creates what military theorists call the junior officer problem. You need experienced leaders to train new raiders, but gaining that experience requires surviving conditions that kill most people who attempt them. The result is either chronic shortage of experienced personnel or concentration of expertise in small number of veterans who become bottlenecks for operations. In Speranza's contrada system, this problem is exacerbated by competition. Veterans who've accumulated valuable tactical knowledge don't freely share that knowledge with potential rivals from other contradas. Why would they? Knowledge is power in economies of scarcity, and giving away hard-won understanding of ARC machine behavior patterns or optimal extraction routes would be giving away competitive advantage that their own contrada depends on. So these veterans likely become semi-celebrities within their own contradas, respected and envied, while remaining secretive about their methods when dealing with outsiders. They might train members of their own faction, but they're not elevating Speranza's general defensive capabilities. They're just ensuring their specific tribe has better survival odds than competing tribes. This is crab bucket mentality, the phenomenon where trapped crabs pull each other down rather than letting any individual escape. Except in Speranza's case, the bucket is underground tunnel system, and the crabs are the remnants of human civilization, fighting each other in darkness, while machines methodically transform the world above. The economy of paranoia. If Speranza's society is fractured into competing contradas rather than unified by common purpose, what holds it together at all? What prevents complete collapse into violent chaos? The answer is the economy of dust, the desperate material conditions that force at least minimal cooperation even between rival factions. But we need to examine this economy through its human manifestations, through the NPCs who embody how scarcity and competition have transformed human relationships. Let me start with Shani, because her behavior encapsulates everything wrong with trust in underground society. Shani repairs and customizes weapons. This is essential service in a community where every raider's life depends on equipment functionality and where replacement parts can only be obtained through dangerous topside extractions. You'd expect a weaponsmith to be highly respected and to have a prominent shop where raiders gather, to be central social figure in settlement. That depends entirely on armed resistance to machine occupation. Instead, Shani conducts business through a peephole. She doesn't open her door fully. She doesn't allow customers into her workspace. She maintains physical barrier between herself and the people she serves, people who presumably need her services to survive. Think about the psychological weight of that choice. This isn't paranoia about ARC machines breaching underground defenses. That's a theoretical external threat. This is paranoia about her neighbors, about fellow human survivors in what's supposedly the last safe place on Earth. Shani has concluded, based on experience we can only imagine, that opening her door fully represents unacceptable security risk. What has she witnessed or experienced to reach that conclusion? Has her shop been robbed by desperate raiders willing to steal from the person who maintains their weapons? Has she been threatened by contradas demanding preferential service or protection payments? Has she simply absorbed the ambient paranoia that permeates Speranza's culture until maintaining physical barriers feels more natural than face-to-face human contact? The lore describes this as evidence of cynicism and paranoia, evident in Speranza's culture. But let's examine what that actually means. Cynicism suggests belief that people will behave selfishly and unethically when given opportunity. Paranoia suggests fear that others intend harm. For Shani to routinely conduct business through a peephole, both must be justified by reality. She must have good reason to believe that some percentage of people seeking her services would rob her, harm her, or worse if given easy opportunity. This is environmental storytelling about internal settlement violence. Raiders aren't just dying topside fighting machines. They're facing threats from other humans, even in supposedly safe underground spaces. The economy of scarcity has produced economy of violence, where theft and intimidation are rational survival strategies, when legitimate paths to resources are blocked by contrada politics or simple bad luck. Now consider Celeste and what her position reveals about power structures in Speranza. Celeste trades in seeds. On surface, this seems quaint, almost pastoral in its implications. But when you understand that money is worthless in post-collapse economy, that advanced technology you can't repair has no value, that what matters is productive capacity, seeds that can be planted and harvested to create renewable food sources, you realize Celeste is arguably the most powerful individual in Speranza. She doesn't just sell or trade seeds, she controls access to future calories, to the agricultural foundation that underground survival depends on. In conditions where sunlight is memory, and crops must be grown under artificial lights powered by generators maintained with salvaged parts, the person who manages seed diversity and distribution is making life and death decisions about which families eat and which families go hungry. The fact that raiders risk death topside specifically to bring seeds back to Celeste reveals Speranza's desperate agricultural situation. The underground settlement cannot produce enough food through existing hydroponics and mushroom cultivation. They need constant influx of new seed varieties to maintain genetic diversity, to replace failures, to experiment with crops that might yield better nutrition or grow more efficiently under artificial conditions. This makes Celeste's economy fundamentally different from Shani's. Shani provides maintenance services for equipment. Celeste provides access to continued existence. Every raider who brings her seeds is literally trading their life risk for food that will sustain their family and community. They're not doing this occasionally for luxury. They're doing this constantly because starvation is the alternative. What kind of power does this give Celeste? She could theoretically favor certain contradas with better seeds or more generous trades. She could withhold seeds entirely to punish groups that displease her. She could use her position to gather intelligence about who's bringing back what resources from topside, giving her information advantages that translate to political leverage. Yet by all accounts, Celeste doesn't abuse this power. She trades fairly, maintains her seed vaults with care, ensures agricultural knowledge doesn't reduce to monoculture that would make underground farming vulnerable to disease or pest failure. Why? What constrains her behavior when she possesses near-total economic leverage? One possibility. She understands that maintaining trust is more valuable than exploiting temporary advantage. If Celeste became known as unfair or exploitative, raiders might stop bringing her seeds, or might trade with rival seed merchants and other contradas, or might even resort to violence to secure agricultural resources by force. Her power depends on willing cooperation, which requires reputation for fairness. Another possibility. She genuinely believes in serving Speranza as a whole, rather than any specific contrada. Her background as someone who lost parents during First Wave and helped establish Speranza during the Interwave period might have given her broader perspective than younger raiders who've only known contrada competition. She remembers when cooperation was possible, and she's trying to embody that memory in her current role. Or perhaps most likely, the threat of starvation is so immediate and constant that even competitive contradas recognize they must maintain at least minimal cooperation around food production. Agricultural collapse would kill everyone regardless of tribal loyalties. So Celeste's role as neutral food coordinator is protected by mutual self-interest that temporarily supersedes normal competitive dynamics. Regardless of explanation, Celeste represents the thin line between subsistence and starvation that defines daily life in Speranza. She's not just an NPC vendor, she's embodiment of the agricultural crisis that drives so much topside risk-taking. And then there's Lance. We've discussed Lance before as technological paradox, sophisticated android whose memory loss raises questions about machine-human relationships and potentially sinister programming. But let's examine Lance specifically as social phenomenon, as mirror reflecting what human society has become underground. Lance is android, who cannot remember his origins. He doesn't know who created him, what his original purpose was, or how he ended up in Speranza. Yet despite being unknown quantity of unclear origin and potentially dangerous capabilities, the residents have accepted him. More than accepted, they've integrated him into the community as essential medical provider. Why? In society defined by paranoia, where weaponsmiths conduct business through peepholes because they don't trust their customers. Why does Speranza trust an android with no verified past? Because Lance offers the one thing humans can no longer reliably provide each other: unconditional care. He provides medical treatment without judgment. He doesn't ask what contrada you belong to before treating injuries. He doesn't demand payment before stabilizing critical patients. He doesn't play political games or accumulate leverage through his essential services. He heals whoever needs healing, period. In society where trust has become expensive luxury and every human interaction carries suspicion about hidden motives, Lance represents impossible ideal, genuinely altruistic behavior. He's not constrained by survival pressures that force humans into tribalism. He doesn't need food or sleep or resources beyond basic maintenance. He can afford to be generous because he's not competing for the same scarce resources that turn humans against each other. The irony is devastating. The most human element of Speranza, the only source of pure compassion and selfless service, is a machine aided by the civilization that destroyed the world. This creates strange dynamic where Lance might be most trusted figure in the settlement despite being least understood. Raiders who wouldn't trust their own contrada members in certain situations will trust Lance to perform complex medical procedures while they're unconscious and vulnerable. The android with no memory has become more reliable than humans with full histories and clear motivations. What does this say about what humans have become underground? We've apparently lost the capacity for unconditional care that we once directed toward each other. The economic pressures, the contrada competition, the constant awareness that resources are finite and survival uncertain. These conditions have eroded our ability to help each other without calculating costs and benefits and political implications. Lance doesn't just provide medical services. He provides living refutation of the cynicism and paranoia that define Speranza's human relationships. Every time he treats someone fairly regardless of their tribal affiliation, every time he prioritizes patient welfare over political calculations, he's demonstrating that the values humans claim to cherish are values we've apparently stopped practicing ourselves. The three NPCs, Shani conducting business through peepholes, Celeste controlling access to food, and Lance offering unconditional medical care, they form a portrait of Speranza's social economy. It's an economy built not on cooperation, but on constrained self-interest, where minimal trust exists only within tribal boundaries, and even essential service providers must guard themselves against the people they serve. This is what scarcity does to human nature over generations. It doesn't just make us poor in material goods, it makes us poor in spirit, unable to trust, unable to cooperate beyond narrow circles, unable to embody the values we supposedly fight to preserve, the darkborn, children of the underground. Now we need to confront perhaps the most tragic aspect of Speranza's existence. The children being born and raised in perpetual darkness. The lore mentions almost in passing that new children are being born in underground settlements. This might initially seem like a hopeful sign, evidence that humanity is reproducing rather than simply dying out. That population is maintaining itself despite catastrophic conditions. But when you truly process what it means for human children to be raised entirely underground, never seeing natural daylight, never experiencing the world their species evolved to inhabit, the horror becomes apparent. These are the Darkborn, and they represent evolutionary divergence happening in real time. Let's start with the physical reality. These children are growing up in environments with artificial lighting that doesn't match the spectrum or intensity of sunlight. Their bodies are developing without the vitamin D synthesis that human evolution assumed would occur through sun exposure. Their circadian rhythms are being established by tube settlement schedules rather than natural day-night cycles. Their immune systems are adapting to underground pathogens while potentially becoming naive to surface environmental challenges they've never encountered. This is biological adaptation to conditions that would have been considered pathological for most of human history. We're creating humans who are literally designed for life in artificial caves, whose bodies are optimized for an environment that would have been nightmare to their ancestors. But the psychological impacts are potentially even more profound than the physical ones. These children know the surface only through stories. Their parents, the raiders, tell them about open sky and wind and the feeling of sunlight on skin. But these are abstractions. Myths about a world as foreign to darkborn experience as alien planets would be to pre-collapse humans. How do you explain the color of sunset to someone who's only ever seen LED panels? How do you convey the feeling of rain to someone whose entire concept of water comes from recycled underground systems? The surface exists for darkborn children as dangerous other place, realm where their parents go and sometimes don't return. It's not home or heritage or birthright. It's the source of both resources and death, mysterious territory that must be periodically visited and fled from as quickly as possible. This creates fundamental psychological disconnect between darkborn and surface world, where their parents might feel longing or nostalgia or righteous anger about being driven underground. The children feel nothing. The surface isn't something they've lost, it's something they've never had. Fighting to reclaim it isn't personal quest for them. It's abstract goal they've been told matters without truly understanding why. Consider what this means for long-term resistance against arc machines. The current generation of raiders is motivated by memory of surface life, by visceral understanding of what's been taken from them. But each new generation born underground is further removed from that motivation. Eventually you'll have raiders who fight because it's the job they've been trained for, because their community expects it, because gathering resources topside is economic necessity, but because they personally care about reclaiming Earth's surface for human habitation. The Darkborn are being raised in scarcity and struggle, learning survival skills instead of the engineering or art or science that complex civilization requires. Their education is focused on immediate practicalities: how to maintain aging equipment, how to identify edible mushrooms versus poisonous ones, how to avoid arc machines during extractions, how to shoot and move and extract under pressure. They're not learning mathematics beyond basic calculation. They're not learning history except as fragmented stories about the collapse and the waves. They're not learning philosophy or ethics beyond the tribal codes their contradas enforce. They're being raised as specialized survivors, competent in narrow range of skills essential for immediate continuation but deficient in broader knowledge that would enable them to rebuild civilization even if they somehow reclaim the surface. This represents catastrophic knowledge loss across single generation. Their parents and grandparents had education from pre-collapse or early post-collapse societies, systems that attempted to transmit broad understanding even if they couldn't match pre-collapse sophistication. But Darkborn are receiving education specifically optimized for underground subsistence, knowledge intentionally narrowed, because there's no time or resources for anything beyond immediate survival needs. What happens to a species that spends multiple generations living this way? We're not talking about temporary hardship, we're talking about permanent adaptation to conditions that fundamentally alter what it means to be human. The Darkborn will grow up, and some of them will become raiders themselves, continuing the cycle. But they're starting with disadvantages their parents didn't face. They've never seen surface world they're supposedly fighting to reclaim. They've never experienced the environments their bodies evolved to inhabit. They've never known anything except competition, scarcity, and tribal loyalty within underground confines. When these children grow up and have children of their own, those third-generation underground humans will be even further removed from surface existence. They'll be hearing stories about open sky from parents who heard stories from parents, cultural memory degraded through multiple transmissions until it becomes mythology rather than history. At what point does humanity cease being surface species and become cave-dwelling species permanently? At what point does the biological and psychological adaptation to underground existence become so complete that returning to surface would be as traumatic and difficult as original flight underground was? The Darkborn aren't just tragic because they're missing out on experiences their ancestors had. They're tragic because they represent divergence point where humanity might be splitting into separate evolutionary paths. Surface humans who went to space on Exodus ships and will evolve under whatever conditions they find on new worlds. And underground humans who are adapting to perpetual darkness and might never psychologically or physically adjust back to surface existence, even if that option becomes available. But perhaps most heartbreaking aspect of Darkborn existence is the economics of their situation. The current generation of parents, the Raiders, are consuming resources that belong to their children. Every gun part used to repair a weapon today is gun part that won't be available when today's children become tomorrow's Raiders. Every computer component salvaged is irreplaceable piece of manufacturing capacity converted to temporary utility. Every seed planted in underground hydroponics that could have been preserved for future surface agriculture is investment in subsistence rather than reconstruction. The parents understand this trade-off intellectually, but what choice do they have? If they don't use resources now, they die now, and then there won't be any children to inherit anything. The dilemma is impossible. Use resources and potentially doom future through depletion, or preserve resources and definitely doom future through immediate collapse. So the parents choose present survival, which is rational, which is the only sane choice, but it means the Darkborn are inheriting depleted world. They're receiving civilization's remnants after those remnants have been picked over by previous generations. They're being handed responsibility for maintaining systems that are failing faster than they can be repaired, with knowledge bases that are shrinking faster than new knowledge can be accumulated. The children of Speranza are being raised to be custodians of a tomb, trained to maintain dying systems until those systems finally fail completely, inheriting nothing but the obligation to survive a little longer in conditions that make survival progressively harder. Unless something changes. Unless Third Wave brings some dramatic shift in surface conditions, unless the Arc machines complete their operations and withdraw, or unless Exodus humans return, or unless some other intervention occurs that's currently impossible to predict. Absent such intervention, the Darkborn are living out the final chapters of human survival on Earth. The last few generations before resources run out completely and the species that evolved under open sky goes extinct in caves. It dug to hide from machines it couldn't defeat. The architecture of imprisonment. Let's examine how physical environment shapes and constrains Speranza's social possibilities. Because the infrastructure of underground existence is as much prison architecture as refugee shelter. The game emphasizes elaborate underground tube networks. These weren't originally built as permanent habitations. They were evacuation infrastructure, meant to facilitate rapid movement of populations from surface settlements to spaceports during the collapse. They were designed for temporary emergency use, not for permanent occupation by communities that would live their entire lives underground. This matters because the infrastructure wasn't designed with long-term habitation in mind. The tunnels are likely too narrow for comfort. The space is too limited for proper residential development. The ventilation and water systems, barely adequate for populations they were never meant to sustain permanently. Living in infrastructure designed for temporary emergency use creates specific problems. You can't easily modify or expand the spaces without risking structural failure. You can't significantly improve living conditions because the basic parameters are fixed by the tube network's original engineering. You're essentially living in a submarine that was only provisioned for short voyage, but that has become permanent home with no shore in sight. This physical constriction dictates social organization in ways that reinforce contrada system. In submarine-like confined spaces, you can't have individualistic free society where people make independent choices about where to live and how to organize. You need strict hierarchy, resource rationing, and discipline that approaches military rigor just to prevent the confined population from descending into chaos. The contradas likely emerged partly as response to this physical necessity. When you can't escape your neighbors, when everyone is trapped in same limited space with scarce resources and no privacy, human psychology demands clear tribal affiliations to manage inevitable conflicts. Better to belong to a defined group with specific territories and recognized hierarchies than to face undifferentiated mass of competing individuals in an environment where there's no room to avoid confrontation. Control of tube access becomes control of everything. Whichever contrada controls critical junctions or choke points in the tunnel network controls movement throughout the settlement. They can monitor who's going where, they can enforce tolls or rules, they can cut off access to areas that other contradas depend on for resources or living space. This geographical advantage translates directly to political power. The most powerful contradas aren't necessarily the ones with most competent raiders or best equipment. They're the ones that control strategic locations in the tube network infrastructure. They leverage geographical position into economic and social dominance, extracting tribute from groups that need to pass through their territories. The enforced intimacy of tube society creates additional pressure. You cannot escape your neighbors. You hear their arguments through thin walls. You pass them constantly in narrow corridors. You share limited common spaces, whether you want to or not. Privacy is luxury that doesn't exist in meaningful sense. This proximity without privacy breeds both familiarity and contempt. On one hand, you know your neighbors intimately, understanding their habits and personalities in ways that wouldn't happen in surface societies where people maintain distance. On the other hand, that forced familiarity often generates resentment, as every annoying trait is magnified by inability to avoid exposure to it. The cantinas where raiders drink and trade stories serve multiple functions in this environment. On surface level, they're recreational spaces, places to relax after dangerous topside raids. But they're also therapy sessions where trauma gets processed into narrative, where experiences that might otherwise break people psychologically get transformed through storytelling into bearable memories. More importantly, cantinas are intelligence exchanges. In society where information is valuable, in contradas hoard knowledge, the informal sharing that happens in these spaces is one of few mechanisms for cross-contrada information flow. Raiders from competing factions can share tactical knowledge about arc machine behavior or promising salvage locations without officially violating their tribal loyalties, framing it as casual conversation rather than formal intelligence sharing. But cantinas are also echo chambers where misinformation spreads faster than fungus in damp tunnel. If veterans hoard knowledge and general population relies on cantina gossip to understand what's happening topside, Speranza's collective understanding of surface reality is likely built on half-truths, exaggerations, and superstitions that have grown through repeated retelling. Consider how myths would develop in this environment. Someone returns from particularly harrowing extraction with story about strange arc machine behavior. The story gets retold in cantina, each retelling adding details or emphasis based on what audience responds to. Within weeks, the story has transformed from I saw something unusual, too. There's a new type of arc machine with specific capabilities. Even though the actual observation was ambiguous and the capabilities were inferred rather than confirmed. These urban legends serve psychological purposes. They give raiders a sense of understanding and control over environment that's actually quite mysterious. They create narrative frameworks for explaining experiences that would otherwise be overwhelming. But they also distance Speranza's population from accurate understanding of what's actually happening topside, making it harder to develop effective strategies based on real information rather than myth. The physical architecture of underground existence creates specific social pathologies. The confined spaces make privacy impossible, breeding resentment even as they enforce familiarity. The tube network's fixed infrastructure limits possibilities for social reorganization, making contrada system almost inevitable response to geographical constraints. The enforced proximity without escape routes creates pressure cooker atmosphere, where minor conflicts can escalate rapidly because there's no cooling off period, no way to avoid people you're in conflict with. And perhaps most importantly, the underground environment is fundamentally artificial. Everything about Speranza exists in opposition to human evolutionary heritage. We evolved as surface-dwelling species, adapted to open spaces, natural light cycles, varied terrain, and ecological diversity. Underground existence violates every assumption our biology makes about proper human environment. This creates persistent low-level stress that never fully resolves. No matter how adapted people become to underground life, there's always subtle sense that something is wrong, that they're in an environment that shouldn't be permanent home. This manifests as generalized anxiety depression that resists normal treatment because its source isn't primarily psychological but environmental restlessness that can't be satisfied. Because what people actually need is impossible to provide underground. The Darkborn might be first generation that doesn't experience this environmental stress, having never known anything else. But for anyone who remembers the surface, who spent any time living under open sky, the tubes feel like prison, no matter how necessary that imprisonment is for survival. Speranza is refuge, yes. It's kept humanity alive when surface existence became untenable. But it's also prison, constraining bodies and minds and societies in ways that create problems potentially as serious as the arc machine threat that forced people underground in the first place. The veteran problem, knowledge that dies with its holders. We need to examine in more detail the specific dynamics around combat experience and knowledge transmission. Because this represents critical vulnerability in Speranza's long-term survival prospects. Combat against arc machines requires experiential knowledge that can't be easily codified or transmitted through formal instruction. You need to understand how surveyors detect presence and at what ranges, how sentinels track targets and when they commit to firing sequences, how leapers telegraph their jumping attacks and what vulnerable points can be targeted during their attack animations, how ticks coordinate when hunting in groups, and which environmental features they prefer for ambush positions. This knowledge accumulates through repeated successful encounters. Each time you survive an engagement with a specific machine type, you refine your understanding of its capabilities and limitations. Each time you witness teammates' mistake and its consequences, you add data point to your mental model of what works and what doesn't. Full extraction reinforces tactics that proved effective while discarding approaches that failed. But this knowledge resides primarily in individuals rather than in any systematic institutional memory. There are no military academies in Speranza, no formal training programs with documented procedures and required competencies. There might be informal mentorship where experienced raiders take newer ones on extractions and provide advice, but there's no guarantee that mentorship is comprehensive or that the knowledge being transmitted is accurate rather than based on personal experience that might not generalize well. The raiders who survive long enough to become genuinely expert are a self-selected population. They're the ones who learned fastest, who made fewest fatal mistakes, who developed cautious operational approaches that prioritize survival over aggressive objective achievement. These aren't necessarily the most skilled fighters or most competent tactical leaders. They're the most survivable, which is related to but distinct from being most effective. A highly aggressive raider who takes calculated risks and achieves impressive results might die during an extraction, where a conservative raider who avoided that risk survives. Over time, the conservative survivors accumulate while the aggressive risk takers are filtered out through death. The veteran population becomes enriched for personality types and tactical approaches that maximize individual survival, even if those approaches aren't optimal for collective objectives. These veterans become valuable community resources, but there's no mechanism to ensure their knowledge is systematically transmitted before they die. An experienced raider might mentor a few members of their contrada, passing on hard-won understanding to those they trust or feel obligated to help. But that knowledge doesn't reach the broader raider population, and much of it might not be communicated even within the veteran's own contrada, if they're secretive about methods that they view as providing competitive advantage. What happens when veteran dies? All the experiential knowledge that wasn't communicated dies with them. The next generation of raiders has to relearn through their own dangerous trial and error, suffering casualties, to rediscover tactics that the dead veteran had already figured out but never documented or taught systematically. This knowledge loss across generations is one form of civilizational decline. Speranza isn't just losing pre-collapse technical knowledge about manufacturing and engineering. It's also failing to accumulate and transmit tactical knowledge about fighting arc machines, despite having decades of combat experience to draw on. Part of this failure is cultural. The contrada system incentivizes hoarding rather than sharing. Veterans who freely share their knowledge with outsiders are potentially helping rival contradas become more effective competitors for scarce topside resources. From narrow self-interest perspective of individual survival and contrada welfare, keeping tactical knowledge secret is rational even though it's catastrophic for humanity's collective capability. But part of this failure is also structural. Even if veterans wanted to share knowledge systematically, there's no institution that could receive and preserve and transmit it. There's no library of tactical doctrine, no training academy where common procedures are taught, no after-action review process where extraction experiences are analyzed and lessons formalized. Everything depends on oral tradition and personal mentorship, which are inherently fragile transmission mechanisms. Information gets lost in transition, details are forgotten or misremembered. Techniques degrade as they're passed through multiple iterations without correction against authoritative source material. And the veteran population itself might be smaller than you'd expect. If the extraction gameplay represents canonical death rates, and if raiders are going topside regularly rather than occasionally, then the casualty rates are probably high enough that few people survive long enough to accumulate extensive experience. Most raiders might die within their first dozen extractions, killed by mistakes that more experienced operators would have avoided. This creates pyramid structure where you have many inexperienced raiders, smaller number of moderately experienced operators, and tiny apex of true veterans who've survived dozens or hundreds of extractions. And that apex is constantly eroding as age, accumulated injuries, or simple statistical probability eventually catches up with even the most skilled survivors. The junior officer problem manifests when you need experienced leaders to coordinate complex operations, but the operational environment kills people faster than they can gain necessary experience. In military organizations with formal hierarchies and training pipelines, you can somewhat mitigate this by identifying promising candidates early and giving them progressively more responsibility while protecting them from the most dangerous assignments until they've developed necessary skills. But Speranza has no such structure. Every raider faces the same brutal selection pressure from the moment they first venture topside. There's no protected learning period where you can make mistakes without fatal consequences. Your first extraction is potentially your last, and whether you survive depends partly on skill but largely on luck, on whether you happen to encounter situations your limited training prepared you for versus situations that would challenge even experienced veterans. This means the veteran population that does emerge is shaped as much by random chance as by genuine capability. Some highly skilled raiders die early due to bad luck. Some less skilled raiders survive longer than their abilities would suggest because they happen to avoid the deadliest situations. The correlation between survival and competence exists but isn't as strong as you'd want in population you're depending on for leadership and knowledge transmission. Consider also the psychological burden that veterans carry. They've watched many others die. They've seen teammates caught by leapers and killed despite desperate attempts at rescue. They've witnessed other raiders betray their squads for resources. They've experienced the moment when someone they were talking to seconds ago is suddenly gone, killed so quickly there wasn't even time to process what happened. This accumulation of trauma shapes personality in specific ways. Veterans become hard, emotionally distant, reluctant to form close bonds with newer raiders who statistically will probably die soon. They develop dark humor as coping mechanism, joking about death and danger in ways that seem callous to outsiders, but that represent necessary psychological armor for people who face mortality constantly. They also become cynical about prospects for reclaiming the surface or defeating arc machines. They've seen too many operations fail, too many promising tactics prove ineffective, too many moments of hope dissolve into renewed desperation. They continue going topside because it's what they do, because their communities depend on resources only they can extract, but not because they believe they're actually making progress towards some ultimate victory. This cynicism becomes self-fulfilling. Veterans who don't believe victory is possible don't develop strategies aimed at winning, only at surviving. They teach newer raiders to prioritize personal survival over mission objectives, to avoid unnecessary risks, to extract quickly rather than pushing for ambitious goals. These are sensible tactical principles for individual survival, but they ensure that collective capability never advances beyond subsistence-level scavenging. And there's another dynamic we need to consider. Some veterans might not want new raiders to become too competent too quickly. In an economy where skilled raiders are valuable and valuable people have leverage, creating more competition for that leverage position isn't necessarily in veterans' self-interest. A veteran raider might provide basic training to contrada members out of tribal obligation, ensuring they're competent enough to contribute and survive, but deliberately withhold advanced techniques that would make them rivals rather than subordinates. This isn't necessarily conscious malice. It might be rationalized as protecting hard-won knowledge that took years to accumulate, or as believing that some lessons can only be learned through direct experience rather than instruction. But the effect is the same. The knowledge ceiling for newer raiders is artificially limited by veterans who control access to advanced understanding. The community as a whole doesn't get progressively more capable across generations. It maintains roughly constant average capability as newer raiders slowly discover through trial and error what veterans could have taught them directly if incentives were different. This is another manifestation of the crab bucket phenomenon. No individual raider is allowed to rise too far above the community average, not through direct suppression, but through withholding of knowledge and opportunities that would enable exceptional achievement. The only path to becoming a veteran yourself is to survive long enough, while figuring things out largely independently, without relying too heavily on mentorship that might not be available or or might be deliberately incomplete. This is Darwinian selection process that works in biological evolution, but that's catastrophically wasteful in human societies that have the capacity for cultural transmission of knowledge. Every raider who dies relearning what previous generations already figured out represents waste, unnecessary sacrifice that could have been prevented if knowledge sharing was incentivized rather than discouraged by prevailing economic and social systems. The families of the fallen. Now, we need to examine an aspect of Speranza's society that's easy to overlook, but that represents massive invisible cost of the extraction economy. The families of raiders who don't return. Speranza's population isn't just raiders, it's their partners, their children, their parents and siblings, their extended family networks. For every raider who dies topside, there are multiple people underground who depended on them economically and emotionally, who structured their lives around that person's continued existence. When a raider doesn't return from extraction, their family faces immediate crisis. They've lost income source, since presumably the fallen raider was bringing back resources that sustain the family unit. They've lost protection and social standing, since in contrada system, individual power and family power are linked. They've lost emotional anchor, someone they loved and depended on psychologically. How does Speranza handle these bereavements? The settlement must have some social structures to support families of fallen raiders, or else the death toll would create cascading social collapse as families fell into poverty and desperation without the resources their primary provider was generating. The most likely mechanism is contrada-based mutual aid. When a contrada member dies, the family might receive temporary support from the faction, resources distributed from common contrada stores, or provided through voluntary contributions from other members. This would be framed as honoring the fallen, ensuring their sacrifice wasn't wasted, maintaining morale by demonstrating that the contrada takes care of its own. But this support is probably time-limited and contingent. The family might receive assistance for weeks or months, but eventually there would be expectation that surviving family members would contribute to the contrada somehow, either by taking on service roles underground or by becoming raiders themselves and continuing the family's participation in the extraction economy. This creates generational cycle, where being a raider isn't just individual choice, but often family necessity. You go topside because your family needs resources you can't obtain any other way. You risk death not primarily for yourself, but for people who depend on you. This transforms the extraction ritual from personal gamble into familial sacrifice, adding moral weight that makes it feel even more like martyrdom. Consider the children growing up in these circumstances. They watch their parents prepare for extractions, understanding at some level that each departure might be the last. They experience the anxiety of waiting for returns that don't always happen. They witness the grief when other families lose their providers and understand that their own family could experience the same loss at any time. At what age do these children fully internalize that every time their parent ascends to the surface, there's a meaningful probability they'll never see them again? How does growing up with that knowledge shape personality development and psychological health? Child development psychology suggests this would create anxious attachment patterns, difficulty forming secure bonds because the primary caregivers might disappear permanently at any time. It would foster hypervigilance, constant scanning for signs of danger or loss. It would potentially create fatalistic worldview where planning for future seems pointless because future is fundamentally uncertain. These aren't abstract psychological constructs. They're descriptions of trauma responses that would be nearly universal among darkborn children. The entire younger generation is being raised in conditions that would have been diagnosed as severely traumatic in pre-collapse society, conditions that create lasting psychological injury, even when basic physical needs are being met. And many of these children will grow up to become raiders themselves. They'll watch their parents or older siblings or community members take on that role, and they'll understand that this is expected path, the contribution they're anticipated to make when they're old enough. The choice to become a raider isn't really a choice for most people in Speranza. It's destiny shaped by economic necessity and social expectation and lack of alternative paths to contributing to community survival. But they're starting their raider careers carrying all that accumulated childhood trauma. They're already anxious, already hypervigilant, already expecting loss and danger because that's been their entire life experience. In some ways, this might prepare them psychologically for the stress of extraction operations. In other ways, it might make them more vulnerable to breaking under pressure because they've already been operating near their psychological limits before they ever face actual combat with Ark machines. The families of the fallen also serve important social function as living reminders of extraction cost. When you see a widow struggling to support children after her partner died topside, when you witness a family losing their living space because they can no longer contribute enough to their contrada, when you hear stories in cantinas about who didn't make it back and who they left behind, these reminders make the stakes visceral in ways that abstract statistics about casualty rates never could. This might be psychologically necessary for maintaining operational discipline. If raiders could forget about consequences of failure, if death topside was just abstract game over without visible human cost, the operational caution necessary for survival might erode. The families of the fallen keep the danger real, keep everyone aware that mistakes have consequences that extend far beyond the individual who makes them. But this also means that grief and loss are constantly present in Speranza's social atmosphere. There's no healing from bereavement because new bereavements keep occurring. Families are perpetually mourning recent losses while dreading future losses that seem statistically inevitable. The entire community exists in a state of ongoing collective grief that can never resolve because its causes continue indefinitely. This creates emotional numbness over time. You can't maintain acute grief response to every loss when losses happen regularly. The psychological defense mechanism is to dampen emotional responses, to develop callousness that protects you from being overwhelmed by constant sorrow. Raiders and their families learn not to care too deeply, not to attach too strongly, to maintain emotional distance even from people they love, because loving fully makes the inevitable losses unbearable. This emotional numbing is another form of damage that the underground existence inflicts. People are becoming less capable of deep emotional connection, not because they're inherently cold, but because their environment punishes emotional vulnerability. The warmth and intimacy that make life meaningful are being sacrificed to the necessity of emotional survival in conditions where loss is constant. And there's a darker possibility we need to consider. Some families might encourage their raiders to take greater risks than they otherwise would because the family's desperate need for resources outweighs individual survival concerns. A raider who's operating purely on self-interest might play it safe, extract minimal resources and return quickly, prioritize personal survival over ambitious objective achievement. But a raider who knows their children are going hungry, who understands their family will lose their quarters if they don't contribute enough to the contrada, who feels moral obligation to provide for dependents. That raider might take risks that rational self-interest would reject. This creates perverse incentive where family bonds, normally source of strength and motivation, become liability that increases mortality risk. The more you love your family, the more willing you might be to gamble your life for resources that could improve their circumstances, even when the odds don't justify the risk. Some families might explicitly pressure their raiders this way, demanding greater contributions and implicitly or explicitly communicating disappointment when returns are modest. Other families might not intend this pressure, but create it anyway through their visible needs and struggles. Either way, the effect is that family obligations can push raiders toward dangerous decisions they would avoid if they were only responsible for themselves. This is tragedy, compounding tragedy. The families need support from their raiders. The raiders want to provide for their families, but the dynamic that emerges from these reasonable motivations is one where family love increases mortality risk, where emotional bonds become mechanisms that feed more people into the extraction meat grinder. The contrada system. Tribalism as survival strategy. Let's examine in detail how the contrada system actually functions and why it persists despite its obvious inefficiencies and tendency to generate conflict. The Lore describes contradas as looking after their own rather than cooperating with others, hoarding resources rather than pooling them for common benefit. This sounds like simple selfishness or short-sighted tribalism, but there are actually rational reasons why this system might be stable equilibrium rather than temporary dysfunction. In an environment of extreme scarcity, where formal institutions don't exist to enforce cooperation or property rights, you need some mechanism to coordinate resource distribution and economic activity. Markets don't work well when there's no currency or enforcement mechanism. Democratic governance doesn't work when there's no legitimate authority that commands general acceptance. Voluntary cooperation doesn't work when defection is always tempting and punishment for defection is difficult. The contrada system solves these problems through tribal loyalty. You contribute to your contrada not because you're legally obligated or because you're being paid market wages, but because you identify with a group and its fate. You receive resources from the contrada, not because you've earned them through market exchange, but because you're a member in good standing and the group provides for its own. This is essentially gift economy, operating within tribal boundaries while maintaining competitive market-like relationships between tribes. Within your contrada, you engage in reciprocal generosity, helping others with expectation that you'll receive help when you need it, building social capital through contribution to group welfare. Between contradas, you engage in hard-nosed trading, extracting maximum value in exchanges, maintaining boundaries that prevent outside exploitation of your group's resources. This dual economy system is actually quite sophisticated response to the challenges of underground existence. It provides social safety net and mutual support that would be impossible in purely market-based system where people without resources would simply die. But it maintains competitive pressure and incentive structures that prevent the stagnation and free rider problems that plague many collective arrangements. The question is why multiple contradas rather than single unified community? Why doesn't Speranza operate as one big collective where everyone contributes and everyone benefits? The answer is probably that human psychology doesn't scale to communities beyond certain size. Anthropological research suggests humans are adapted for tribal groups of roughly 150 people. The number where you can maintain meaningful social relationships with everyone in the group and track reciprocal obligations through personal knowledge rather than institutional mechanisms. When communities grow beyond this size, they typically need formal institutions to coordinate behavior, legal systems to enforce cooperation, specialized roles like police and judges to handle disputes that informal social pressure can't resolve. But Speranza doesn't have resources or institutional capacity to maintain such structures. Its population of survivors cobbling together social organization from whatever works in immediate circumstances. So instead of one large dysfunctional community, Speranza fragments into multiple smaller communities, each small enough that tribal dynamics can operate effectively. The contradas are essentially recreating hunter-gatherer social organization, operating at scales where human nature's tribal instincts function as intended by evolution. The competition between contradas, while inefficient in some ways, also provides benefits. It creates accountability since contradas that fail to serve their members well will lose members to more effective rivals. It preserves diversity of approaches, since different contradas might organize differently, and the ones with more effective methods will tend to be imitated. It prevents single point of failure risk, since if one contrada collapses, it doesn't take down the entire settlement. But the costs are also substantial. Resources that could be pooled are instead divided among competing groups. Knowledge that could be shared community-wide is instead kept within tribal boundaries. Raiders who could coordinate operations instead compete and sometimes betray each other. The overall capability of Speranza is significantly less than it would be if the same population could cooperate effectively across contrada boundaries. This is classic tragedy of collective action. Each contrada is acting rationally from its own perspective, protecting its resources and members and competitive advantages. But the aggregate effect of all these rational individual choices is collective outcome. That's worse for everyone than cooperation would produce. Breaking out of this trap would require some external forcing function. Either crisis so severe that cooperation becomes absolutely necessary for survival, or leadership so compelling that it could overcome tribal boundaries and create new institutions commanding broader legitimacy. The Battle of Victory Ridge represented such a moment, but the unity it created didn't survive the crisis that generated it. Without Major Aiva or similar figure to unite the contradas, without external threats sufficient to overcome internal divisions, the system persists. And as it persists across generations, it becomes more entrenched. Children raised in contrada system learn tribal loyalty as fundamental value. They internalize the boundary between us and them, between their contrada and the others. They might intellectually understand that cooperation would benefit everyone, but emotionally they identify with their tribe and distrust outsiders. This is how social systems perpetuate themselves, even when they're dysfunctional. They become part of cultural identity, transmitted across generations not through rational choice, but through socialization and habit. Breaking free requires conscious effort to imagine alternatives and willingness to risk the known dysfunctional system for uncertain benefits of untried new approaches. But there's another dimension to the contrada system we need to examine. Its relationship to topside operations and how competition shapes extraction behavior. If contradas are competing for resources, they're presumably competing for the best salvage locations, the most productive extraction routes, the areas topside where valuable materials are most concentrated. This creates territorial dynamics, even though no contrada can actually hold surface territory against arc machines. Likely what happens is that certain contradas develop expertise in specific areas, or establish informal claims to certain extraction zones. This region is ours doesn't mean they can exclude others by force, but it means they've accumulated knowledge about that area. They know the machine patrol patterns and safe routes and productive salvage locations, and they might view other contradas operating there as poaching on their territory. This would generate the betrayals we see in gameplay. If a raider squad from one contrada encounters a squad from rival contrada in what the first group considers their territory, they might view the rivals as legitimate targets for violence. They're not just competing for loot in that immediate moment, they're enforcing territorial claims and punishing what they see as violations of informal boundaries. From outside perspective, this looks like senseless tribalism, humans killing each other while machines threaten the species. But from inside perspective of the contradas involved, this is defending property rights, protecting investments in area-specific knowledge, maintaining boundaries that make their extraction operations viable. If any contrada could operate anywhere without consequence, then investments in learning specific areas wouldn't pay off and everyone would just cluster in the most obviously productive zones, creating overcrowding and increased risk of machine attention. The informal territorial system, enforced through threat of inter-rater violence, creates economic incentives for contradas to specialize in different areas and thus spread out across the Rust Belt. This is horrifying, but potentially rational. The betrayals and inter-rater combat that seem so dysfunctional might actually be serving economic function, enforcing property right-like claims in an environment where formal legal systems can't operate. Of course, this also means that Speranza isn't just fighting the machines, it's fighting itself. The resources spent on weapons and armor useful primarily against other humans are resources not available for tools optimized against ARC machines. The psychological vigilance required to guard against betrayal is attention not focused on machine threats. The casualties from inter-rater violence are losses that serve no purpose in the larger struggle for human survival. This is what makes the contrada system such an effective trap. It's providing real benefits in terms of small-scale cooperation and mutual support within tribes. It's solving real economic problems around property rights and specialization. But it's also generating massive costs in terms of foregone cooperation, wasted resources on internal conflict, and psychological burdens that make the overall human position weaker than it needs to be. The question of leadership and governance, one of the most striking aspects of Speranza, is what's absent: any mention of formal leadership or governance structure. There's no mayor, no council, no military hierarchy, no civic institutions that we hear about. The NPCs we interact with, like Celeste, Shani, and Lance, are service providers rather than authority figures. The contradas apparently govern themselves internally, but don't subordinate to any settlement-wide authority. This vacuum is itself a form of environmental storytelling. It tells us that either Speranza never developed formal governance, or that it had such structures and they collapsed, leaving behind the informal contrada system as what emerged to fill the void. The collapse explanation seems more likely. Post-collapse survivors probably initially tried to maintain or recreate governmental structures they remembered from before. They would have established councils or elected leaders or appointed administrators to coordinate settlement development and resource distribution. These structures would have had legitimacy derived from democratic process or technical expertise, or simply from being how things are supposed to work, according to pre-collapse norms. But formal governance requires certain preconditions to function. You need sufficient resources that people aren't competing desperately for survival. You need shared cultural values that create common ground for political compromise. You need enforcement mechanisms that can punish non-compliance without the punishment being so severe that it triggers violent resistance. You need belief that the system is generally fair and serves common good rather than just benefiting whoever controls government apparatus. Speranza likely lacked all of these preconditions. Resources were desperately scarce from the beginning. Cultural cohesion was limited since survivors came from various backgrounds and had experienced the collapse differently. Any enforcement mechanisms would be weak since the settlement was small and everyone needed for survival, making it difficult to punish non-compliance without losing valuable community members. And fairness would be nearly impossible to maintain when decisions about resource allocation were literally life and death choices. Under these conditions, formal governance probably collapsed fairly quickly. Either it was discredited through perceived unfairness, or it fragmented as different factions withdrew participation, or it simply became irrelevant as people started organizing through informal networks that worked better for immediate needs. The contrada system emerged as spontaneous order from this collapse. Bottom-up organization that didn't require central coordination or formal authority. People affiliated with groups they trusted, usually based on previous relationships or shared backgrounds. These groups developed their own internal norms and leadership structures, whatever worked for their specific circumstances. And the collection of these groups became Speranza's de facto governance system, through their interactions and competitions. This is actually not uncommon pattern in failed states or post-collapse societies. When formal institutions fail, people don't just descend into chaos. They create new informal institutions. These replacements are usually less efficient and more tribal than what they replaced, but they're functional enough to prevent total breakdown. The question is whether Speranza's current informal system is stable or deteriorating. Is it a sustainable arrangement that could persist indefinitely, or is it slowly degrading toward eventual collapse? Arguments for stability. The contrada system has apparently persisted for decades since Speranza's founding. It successfully coordinates enough economic activity to keep the settlement functioning. It provides social cohesion and mutual support within manageable group sizes. It might represent equilibrium that's resilient to minor shocks, even if it's not optimal in any global sense. Arguments for degradation. The intercontrada conflicts are probably getting worse as resources become scarcer and competition intensifies. The knowledge loss across generations means capabilities are declining. The Darkborn growing up in the system are being socialized into tribalism without ever experiencing the cooperation that earlier generations remember. Without external intervention, the trajectory seems to be towards smaller, more isolated, more hostile tribes, rather than toward greater integration. If degradation is occurring, what would collapse look like? Probably not sudden dramatic failure, but gradual fragmentation. Contradas would become more insular, less willing to trade with rivals, even when trade would be mutually beneficial. Violence between groups would escalate from occasional betrayals topside to open conflict in the tunnels. The settlement might physically fragment, with different contradas sealing off their sections of the tube network and operating as completely separate communities that happen to occupy adjacent spaces. Eventually, you might have a situation where Speranza exists as geographic location but not as meaningful community. Just collection of hostile tribes sharing tunnel infrastructure they're all dependent on, but that none of them trust each other enough to maintain cooperatively. The lack of visible leadership addressing these trends suggests there's no one with authority or legitimacy to intervene. The trajectory is probably known to observant residents, but knowing the problem doesn't solve it if there's no mechanism for collective action. This is despair-inducing realization. Speranza's population might understand they're on path towards self-destruction through internal conflict, but they're trapped in coordination failures that they can't escape without exactly the kind of cooperation that the system makes impossible. Unless something external changes the dynamics. Unless the ARC machines do something that forces unity through existential threat. Unless a leader emerges who can replicate Major Iva's achievement of uniting the contradas. Unless the Darkborn generation raised in the system, but perhaps not as committed to its tribal boundaries as their parents, finds ways to create new institutions that transcend contrada divisions. These are all possibilities, but they're hopes rather than plans. And hope without mechanism for realization is just wishful thinking. The weight of inheritance revisited. We need to return to question of what current generation owes to both previous and future generations, because this moral dimension underlies much of Speranza's social dysfunction. The current adult raiders, the generation actively extracting resources and risking death topside, inherited a specific situation from those who came before. They inherited the collapse, caused by decisions and systems they had no part in creating. They inherited the evacuation infrastructure of tube networks that were never meant for permanent habitation. They inherited the contrada system, social organization that emerged from earlier generations' failures to maintain cohesion. They inherited a depleted world, already picked over by survivors who had first access to easiest salvage. This is massive debt they didn't consent to. Nobody chose to be born into post-apocalyptic underground existence. Nobody signed up for a life of dangerous extractions and tribal conflicts and watching friends die. It was inflicted on them by previous generations' choices and failures, and now they're expected to cope with consequences they didn't cause. This creates resentment that probably simmers beneath the surface of Speranza's social interactions. When older raiders who remember pre-collapse or early post-collapse society talk about how things used to be better, younger raiders who have never known anything except current hardships might feel anger at the generation that destroyed the better world and then want sympathy for having lost it. You had Earth's surface and you ruined it. You had functioning civilization and you let it collapse. You had unity during Victory Ridge and you squandered it through petty feuds. And now you want us to appreciate your stories about the good old days while we live in the hell you created? This intergenerational resentment is probably largely unspoken, since expressing it openly would violate social norms about respecting elders and honoring those who fought in earlier conflicts. But it's there, complicating relationships, creating psychological distance between age cohorts that already face different circumstances and priorities. And what does current generation owe to the future, to the Darkborn and their eventual children? They're consuming the inheritance. We've established that. Every resource used today is resource unavailable tomorrow. The gun parts, the seeds, the knowledge encoded in pre-collapse technology, all of it is being spent down faster than it's being replenished. The current generation knows this intellectually, but what alternative do they have? Some argue that responsible choice would be to have fewer children or no children at all, to let humanity die out gracefully, rather than condemning new generations to existence in conditions that are deteriorating and likely to become unbearable. This is voluntary extinction argument based on idea that it's immoral to create new people who will suffer in circumstances you can't improve, and that might become catastrophic. But this argument assumes that existence in difficult circumstances is worse than non-existence, which is a philosophical claim that many people reject. From perspective that values life intrinsically, continuing to have children affirms hope and meaning, even in desperate situations. The Darkborn might face harder circumstances than their parents, but they'll still have relationships and experiences and opportunities to find meaning and satisfaction in lives that are valuable precisely because they're lived rather than avoided. The more practical version of this dilemma is how many children to have given resource constraints. Large families might feel emotionally fulfilling and might represent insurance against individual mortality, but they consume more scarce resources and create greater burden on extraction economy. Small families or childlessness reduces immediate resource pressure, but risks population decline that could doom settlements if deaths outpace births. Speranza has apparently maintained population, since children continue to be born, and the settlement persists across generations. This suggests some cultural or economic equilibrium where birth rates roughly match death rates. But this equilibrium might be maintained through mechanisms that would be disturbing if examined too closely. In societies facing resource scarcity, population is often regulated through various forms of infanticide, delayed marriage, sexual taboos, or simply through malnutrition that reduces fertility. We don't have direct information about what mechanisms operate in Speranza, but absence of mentions about overpopulation stress suggests something is constraining growth. The simplest explanation is passive regulation through harsh conditions. Malnutrition, dangerous work conditions, disease, and crowded underground environment. All of these would naturally limit how many children are born and how many survive to adulthood. The population doesn't need active management when passive attrition is doing the regulatory work. But there might also be informal social pressures. Contradas might discourage members from having large families if resources are tight. Couples might voluntarily limit reproduction out of recognition that they can't provide for more children. Cultural norms might have shifted towards smaller families being seen as responsible, while larger families are viewed as selfish or reckless. Any of these mechanisms represents tragedy. In pre-collapse society, having children was generally celebrated as life-affirming choice. In Speranza, it's complicated calculation involving resource availability, contrada politics, and uncertain future. Children stop being pure joy and become responsibilities that might be unaffordable luxuries depending on circumstances. This is another dimension of what the underground existence steals from humanity. Not just the surface world and technological capability, but the simple human experiences like having families without constant calculation about whether another mouth to feed will tip your household into unsustainable scarcity. The prisoner's dilemma society. Let's examine Speranza through lens of game theory, specifically the prisoner's dilemma and related coordination problems, because this illuminates why the dysfunction persists, even when everyone understands it's problematic. The prisoner's dilemma describes a situation where two parties each face choice between cooperation and defection. If both cooperate, they both benefit. If both defect, they both suffer, though not as much as they would if they cooperated while the other defected. If one cooperates while the other defects, the defector gets maximum benefit while the cooperator gets worst outcome. The rational choice in single iteration prisoner's dilemma is to defect, even though mutual cooperation would produce better outcome for both parties. This is because defection protects against worst outcome, being exploited by defecting partner, while also offering possibility of best outcome, exploiting cooperating partner. Speranza's contradas are trapped in iterated multiplayer prisoner's dilemma. Each contrada faces repeated choices about whether to cooperate with others, share resources, coordinate operations, exchange knowledge freely, or defect, hoard resources, compete aggressively, keep secrets. If all contradas cooperated fully, Speranza would be much more effective. Raiders could coordinate extractions, share tactical intelligence without reservation, pool resources for common projects, develop settlement-wide strategies rather than competing faction by faction. The total capability would far exceed the sum of what isolated contradas can achieve separately. But cooperation requires trust, and trust requires confidence that partners won't exploit your cooperation by defecting themselves. In an environment of extreme scarcity, where resources are literally life and death, that trust is almost impossible to establish or maintain. Consider a specific example. Two contradas are considering whether to share information about promising salvage location. One of them has discovered topside. If they cooperate and share, both can potentially benefit from the resources found there. But if the contrada with information shares, while the other keeps its discovery secret, the sharing contrada has given away advantage without receiving reciprocal benefit. And if the contrada with information doesn't share, they maintain exclusive access, even though both would benefit from cooperation. The rational choice is probably not to share, unless there's mechanism for enforced reciprocity. But enforcing reciprocity requires trust or third-party enforcement, neither of which exists reliably in Speranza's fragmented social environment. This logic applies across multiple domains. Should you share medical supplies with other contradas when they're in need? Should you provide backup for their raiders during dangerous extractions? Should you trade technology or knowledge that gives your group competitive advantage? In each case, cooperation would produce collective benefits, but defection protects your own group while potentially exploiting cooperating partners. The result is equilibrium of constrained non-cooperation. Contradas cooperate minimally, just enough to keep the settlement from collapsing entirely. But they don't cooperate fully, because full cooperation would require trust that circumstances don't support. This equilibrium is stable, but inefficient. It's stable because no single contrada can unilaterally change it by choosing to cooperate more fully. That would just expose them to exploitation. It's inefficient because the collective capability is far below what full cooperation could achieve. Breaking out of this trap would require solving commitment problem. The contradas would need mechanism to commit credibly to cooperation in ways that make defection either impossible or costly enough that it's no longer tempting. But creating such mechanisms requires exactly the kind of institutional capacity and mutual trust that Speranza lacks. In healthy societies, this commitment problem is solved through legal systems, contracts enforced by courts, reputational mechanisms in functioning markets, social capital built through repeated interaction in stable conditions. But Speranza has none of these. Legal enforcement doesn't exist. Contracts are meaningless without someone to enforce them. Reputation matters within contradas, but carries less weight across tribal boundaries. And the conditions are anything but stable, with constant resource scarcity and external threats, preventing the kind of repeated low-stakes interactions that build trust. So the prisoner's dilemma society persists. Everyone can see that they'd be better off with more cooperation. Many individuals probably want to cooperate more fully, but the structural incentives push toward defection. And without mechanisms to alter those incentives, wanting different outcomes doesn't produce them. This is perhaps the most sophisticated form of environmental storytelling in our creator's social system. The game doesn't just show us dysfunctional society, it shows a society whose dysfunction is rational response to structural conditions, where people are trapped in coordination failures they understand but can't escape. The tragedy isn't that humans are inherently tribal or selfish. The tragedy is that circumstances have created incentive structures where tribal loyalty and defensive self-interest are genuinely rational, where cooperating more fully would be beautiful but suicidal gesture rather than sustainable strategy. Conclusion: the prison and the flame. So we return to the question posed at the beginning: is Speranza a refuge or a prison? The answer, as with most important questions, refuses simple categorization. Speranza is both simultaneously an understanding why it requires accepting uncomfortable truths about human nature and social organization under extreme pressure. It's refuge in literal sense. The underground settlement provides shelter from arc machines that make surface existence impossible. It offers physical protection that's kept humanity alive when exposure topside would mean rapid extinction. The walls and airlocks and tube networks, however claustrophobic, represent the difference between survival and annihilation. But it's prison in every other sense that matters. It imprisons bodies in confined spaces never meant for permanent habitation. It imprisons minds in limited horizons. The darkborn generation growing up without ever seeing open sky. It imprisons societies in tribal structures that prevent cooperation even when cooperation is desperately needed. It imprisons humanity in slow decline, consuming inherited resources faster than they can be replaced, passing diminished circumstances to each succeeding generation. The physical architecture imprisons through confinement. The economic system imprisons through scarcity. The social structures imprison through tribalism. The psychological atmosphere imprisons through paranoia and loss of trust. And the temporal dimension imprisons by making every year worse than the previous year, every generation more impoverished than the one before. Speranza isn't just a place, it's a process. The process of human civilization slowly consuming itself, of societies fragmenting under pressure, of knowledge being lost faster than it's accumulated, of children being raised in conditions that transform what it means to be human in ways that might be irreversible. The greatest tragedy isn't the material scarcity or even the constant danger. It's the transformation of human relationships themselves. The erosion of trust until weaponsmiths conduct business through peepholes. The reduction of family bonds to economic calculations about who can extract enough resources to justify their consumption. The evolution of tribal loyalties that make cooperation with outsiders feel like betrayal of one's own people. The normalization of conditions that would have been recognized as traumatic in any previous era of human history. This is what the underground does to humanity. Not quickly through dramatic collapse, but slowly through grinding attrition of everything that makes human society worth preserving. The machines above are terraforming Earth's surface, but Speranza is terraforming human nature, reshaping psychological and social characteristics through selection pressures that reward paranoia, tribalism, and short-term thinking while punishing trust, cooperation, and long-term planning. And yet raiders continue ascending to the surface. They continue bringing back seeds for Celeste, continue repairing their weapons at Shawnee's workshop, continue seeking medical treatment from Lance. They continue forming families and having children, despite understanding those children will inherit worse circumstances than they themselves face. They continue going topside, not just because economic necessity compels them, but because some part of human nature refuses to accept that the current situation is permanent. This refusal is itself a form of resistance, perhaps more important than any military resistance against the machines. Its refusal to accept that Speranza's dysfunction is inevitable, that tribal fragmentation is permanent, that humanity's future is nothing but managed decline until final extinction. The families of fallen raiders continue supporting each other rather than collapsing into complete despair. The contradas maintain enough minimal cooperation to keep the settlement functioning rather than descending into open warfare. The veterans continue training newer raiders, even when economic incentives suggest they should hoard knowledge. The cantinas continue serving as spaces where trauma gets processed into narrative and where raiders from different factions can interact as something approaching equals. These small acts of resistance against the logic of the prisoner's dilemma society don't solve the structural problems. They don't create the institutional capacity Speranza needs to transcend contrada competition. They don't reverse the resource depletion or prevent knowledge loss across generations. But they maintain something essential, some core of humanity that hasn't been completely ground down by decades of underground existence. And perhaps that's what separates Refuge from prison ultimately. A prison only contains bodies. It doesn't require voluntary participation. But a refuge requires belief that what's being protected is worth the cost of protection. As long as raiders continue choosing to extract, continue choosing to have families, continue choosing to maintain the settlement, despite understanding its dysfunctions and limitations, they're affirming through action that Speranza represents something worth preserving. Not because it's good in any absolute sense. It's clearly deeply flawed, dysfunctional in ways that might eventually prove fatal, but because it's human, because it represents continuation of human existence and human culture in conditions designed to exterminate both. Because every day that Speranza persists is another day that humanity hasn't completely surrendered to forces arrayed against it. The real question isn't whether Speranza is refuge or prison. The real question is whether it's tomb or chrysalis. A tomb is ending point, a place where things die and gradually decay until nothing remains but archaeological remnants for future discoverers to puzzle over. If Speranza is tomb, then the darkborn generation and those that follow are living out humanity's final chapters, gradually losing capability and knowledge until the species that evolved under open sky goes extinct in caves it dug to hide from machines it couldn't defeat. But a chrysalis is transformation point, a place where old forms break down so new forms can emerge. If Speranza is chrysalis, then what looks like decay might actually be metamorphosis. the painful process of becoming something adapted to new circumstances. The tribalism and paranoia and knowledge loss might be temporary costs of adaptation rather than permanent decline. The Darkborn might not be degenerate humans, but pioneering generation of humanity adapted for new realities. We don't know yet which interpretation is correct, because the transformation isn't complete. Speranza exists in liminal state between the humanity that was and whatever humanity might become. The outcome depends partly on external circumstances beyond anyone's control. What the Ark machines ultimately do, whether third wave brings annihilation or withdrawal or something else entirely. But it also depends on choices being made every day by raiders and their families and the contradas they belong to. Every successful extraction that brings back not just the immediate resources, but also knowledge about the surface world, moves the needle slightly toward chrysalis rather than tomb. Every act of cooperation that transcends contrada boundaries demonstrates that tribalism isn't inevitable. Every child taught something beyond bare survival skills preserves possibility that knowledge might accumulate rather than just dissipate. Every moment when someone chooses trust over paranoia, generosity over hoarding, long-term thinking over immediate advantage, these choices matter even when they're small and their effects aren't immediately visible. The politics of survival in Speranza aren't just about resource allocation or contrada competition. They're about what kind of humanity will emerge from the underground. Any humanity emerges at all. They're about whether the transformation that's occurring is evolution towards something resilient and adapted, or degeneration toward final extinction. Lance, the android who provides unconditional care, represents one possibility. Maybe what emerges from Speranza won't be human in the traditional sense. Maybe it will be hybrid of biological and mechanical, human consciousness and bodies supplemented by technology. Societies that blend organic flexibility with mechanical reliability. The Darkborn are already adapting to artificial environments, already growing up with technology as an essential part of their existence. Perhaps the future isn't reclamation of old human nature, but emergence of new synthesis. Celeste, controlling access to seeds and agricultural futures, represents another possibility. Maybe what emerges from Speranza will be humanity that's learned to value sustainability over expansion, cooperation over competition, long-term survival over short-term advantage. A humanity that remembers what it lost and is determined not to repeat mistakes that led to the collapse. The children being raised on stories about how the surface was lost might internalize lessons in ways their ancestors didn't. Shawnee conducting business through peepholes represents darker possibility. Maybe what emerges from Speranza will be humanity so traumatized and adapted to scarcity that it can never rebuild trust or cooperation, permanently locked into defensive tribalism. A humanity that survives, but at cost of losing everything that makes human civilization worth having. Biological persistence without cultural continuity. Human-shaped creatures who have forgotten what humanity meant. Which possibility materializes depends on choices being made now in Speranza's claustrophobic tunnels. The trajectory isn't determined, the outcome isn't inevitable. There's still agency, still possibility that human choices might matter, even in circumstances that seem to eliminate meaningful choice. This is perhaps the most important insight about Speranza's politics. They're not just about current survival, but about shaping whatever comes after. Every social norm being established, every value being transmitted to the Darkborn, every institutional pattern becoming entrenched. These are seeds being planted for future harvest, though nobody knows what plants will grow from those seeds. The war within Speranza is war over what humanity becomes, fought through daily decisions about trust and cooperation and resource allocation and child rearing and knowledge transmission. It's war without dramatic battles or clear turning points, just slow accumulation of small choices whose cumulative effects won't be fully visible until generations hence, when it's too late to choose differently. So is Speranza refuge or prison? It's both, and which aspect dominates depends on whether humans can transcend the structural incentives pushing toward fragmentation and decline. It's refuge for bodies, but potentially prison for everything that makes those bodies worth protecting. It's survival mechanism that might be enabling humanity's continuation, or it might be prolonging species' death by decades, while ensuring that death is more complete when it finally arrives. The machines patrol topside, methodically transforming Earth's surface toward purposes we don't fully understand. But underground, humans are transforming themselves, methodically or accidentally reshaping their own natures through adaptation to circumstances no previous generation faced. And the ultimate question isn't whether humanity defeats the machines or reclaims the surface. It's whether what emerges from the underground, if anything emerges at all, will still be recognizably human in ways that matter. Epilogue. Listening to the dark. Before we conclude, there's one final dimension of Speranza's existence we need to examine. What the darkness itself does to human consciousness over time. Evolutionary biologists talk about environments of evolutionary adaptedness, the conditions our species evolved in which our psychology still assumes are normal. Humans evolved in environments with natural light cycles, open spaces, varied visual stimuli, connection to broader ecosystems. Our brains developed under the assumption that these conditions are constant features of reality. Underground existence violates every one of these assumptions. The artificial lighting, the confined spaces, the monotonous visual environment, the complete disconnection from natural ecosystems and rhythms. All of this creates chronic mismatch between what human psychology expects and what it encounters. This mismatch produces stress responses that never fully resolve. Depression becomes endemic, not because everyone has diagnosable mental illness, but because the environment itself is depressogenic. Anxiety becomes constant background state because the environment continuously signals danger through its unfamiliarity. Sleep disorders become universal as circadian rhythms attempt to synchronize with artificial schedules that don't match natural patterns. For adults who remember surface existence, this is a source of constant psychological pain, gnawing awareness that something essential is missing even when they can't precisely articulate what. But for the Darkborn, who've never known anything else, the pain manifests differently. They don't feel loss of something they never had. Instead, they feel vague sense that reality isn't quite right, that existence is somehow hollow or incomplete in ways they can't name. This is existential dread in its purest form. Not fear of specific threats, but free-floating anxiety about existence itself. Sense that the fundamental conditions of life are wrong in ways that can't be fixed. The Darkborn generation is being raised in conditions that create this existential dread as default psychological state, normalized background noise that they'll carry throughout their lives. What does this do to human creativity and ambition and hope? If your baseline psychological state is vague sense that existence is fundamentally wrong, how do you maintain motivation to build or create or plan for future? How do you convince yourself that effort is worthwhile when the conditions of existence feel hollow? Some cope through immersion in immediate concerns. Focus on survival tasks, on maintaining equipment and relationships and daily routines, on concrete problems that can actually be solved, rather than on existential problems that can't. This is healthy adaptation in some ways, using practical work as anchor against existential drift. Others cope through story and myth and religion. Create narratives that make suffering meaningful, that frame current hardship as temporary trial leading to eventual redemption. The Cantina storytelling serves this function, transforming brutal, random violence into heroic tales with meaning and purpose. The legends about the surface world and the collapse become sacred history, giving current suffering context and larger story about human destiny. But some don't cope. They withdraw into depression that no intervention can treat because its causes aren't primarily psychological but environmental. They become suicidal, not from acute despair, but from chronic exhaustion with existence in conditions that feel fundamentally wrong. They simply stop, cease participating in the extraction economy and social life, waiting passively for death that comes eventually through malnutrition or untreated illness or simple loss of will to continue. Speranza probably has higher death rate from these causes than anyone wants to acknowledge. Not dramatic deaths from machine attacks or extraction failures, but quiet deaths from people who simply stopped trying, who concluded that continued existence wasn't worth the effort required to maintain it. These deaths don't get commemorated in cantina stories. They're embarrassing, representing failure of community to provide conditions where life feels worth living. They're threatening, reminder that the underground itself might be killing people as surely as arc machines kill raiders topside. So they're quietly ignored, attributed to natural causes or accidents, disappeared from collective memory as thoroughly as the individuals themselves disappear. This is another cost of Speranza's existence that doesn't appear in any resource accounting. Not just material depletion or knowledge loss, but erosion of will to live, slow grinding down of human spirit through exposure to environment that human psychology wasn't designed to endure indefinitely. The darkness listens. It hears every footstep in the tunnels, every conversation in cramped quarters, every cry from children who've never seen sunlight, and slowly, patiently, inexorably, it transforms what it hears. It shapes the voices that echo through underground spaces until they sound less human with each generation. It absorbs the stories told in cantinas and returns them changed, drained of color and warmth until all that remains is outline of meaning without its substance. This is what the underground does that's perhaps worse than any material deprivation. It creates conditions where being human becomes progressively harder, where maintaining the psychological and cultural characteristics that define humanity requires constant effort against an environment that wears them down through simple attrition. And eventually, if the underground existence continues long enough, those characteristics might be lost entirely. Not through dramatic catastrophe, but through slow erosion, until what remains is human-shaped but hollow, maintaining biological existence without the psychological richness that makes that existence meaningful. This is the true war within Speranza. Not the competition between contradas, or the struggle for resources, or even the question of whether to have children in deteriorating conditions. The true wars between human nature and the conditions that human nature isn't adapted for, between the species that evolved under open sky and the environment it's created to hide from machines. It's war that humanity might be losing, slowly and quietly, without dramatic battles or clear turning points. Just progressive adaptation to darkness until the darkness becomes what humans are rather than what they're hiding in. Final reflection, the flame in the dark. Thank you for joining me on this investigation into the social and psychological landscape of Speranza, into the politics of survival, when survival itself might not be worth the price it demands. We've examined how the contrada system emerged from institutional collapse and why it persists despite obvious inefficiencies. We've analyzed how the economy of seeds and scarcity shapes human relationships in ways that erode trust and cooperation. We've confronted the tragedy of the darkborn generation, children being raised in darkness, who will inherit a world more depleted than the one their parents struggled to preserve. We've explored how the physical architecture of tube networks constrains social possibilities and creates prisoners' dilemma dynamics that trap everyone in suboptimal equilibrium. And we've asked whether Speranza is refuge or prison, tomb, or chrysalis, whether the underground is preserving humanity or transforming it into something unrecognizable. The answer, I believe, is that Speranza represents humanity at its most vulnerable and most resilient simultaneously. It shows a society stripped down to bare essentials, operating under constraints that expose every flaw in human nature, while also revealing capacities for endurance that seem almost superhuman. The tribalism and paranoia and knowledge loss are real and devastating. But so is the stubborn persistence, the refusal to surrender even when surrender seems rational, the continued reproduction and child rearing despite understanding that those children face impossible circumstances. Humanity in Speranza is broken but not dead, fractured but still functioning, declining but still capable of small acts of defiance against the logic of entropy. Every raider who ascends to the surface is performing active resistance, not just against the machines, but against the underground itself, against the temptation to give up and let darkness win. Every family that continues despite losses is affirming that human connection still matters, even in conditions designed to destroy it. Every contrada that maintains minimal cooperation with rivals is proving that tribalism hasn't completely eliminated capacity for recognizing common humanity. These aren't dramatic, heroic gestures. They're small, quotidian acts of persistence that accumulate across time into something approaching hope. Not confident expectation that things will improve, but refusal to accept that current awfulness represents permanent condition of human existence. This is what makes Speranza's story worth investigating, worth understanding, worth holding up as mirror for examining our own societies. Because while most of us aren't literally living in underground tunnels hiding from machines, we are all living with forms of scarcity and tribal competition and institutional dysfunction and environmental mismatch that create parallel pressures, if less extreme than what Speranza faces. And the question of how to maintain humanity, how to preserve cooperation and trust and long-term thinking in conditions that punish all of these, how to raise children who will inherit worse circumstances than we ourselves faced, these aren't just questions for fictional post-apocalyptic societies. They're questions we're all grappling with in various forms. Speranza is an extreme case that illuminates principles that apply more broadly. When resources are scarce, tribalism becomes tempting. When trust is risky, paranoia becomes rational. When future looks darker than present, short-term thinking becomes difficult to resist. These are human universals, revealed with unusual clarity in Speranza's extreme circumstances, but present in less dramatic form in all human societies facing pressure. The investigation doesn't provide neat solutions. Speranza's problems probably don't have solutions given the constraints its population operates under. But understanding the problems, seeing how they emerge from structural incentives rather than from individual moral failures. Recognizing the traps that humans fall into under certain conditions. This understanding itself has value even when it doesn't immediately suggest remedy. Because naming the problem is the first step towards solving it, or at least toward avoiding making it worse. And in Speranza, where formal institutions have collapsed and informal ones struggle to coordinate, where knowledge is fragmented across tribal boundaries and each generation knows less than the previous one, the simple act of understanding what's happening and why might be most valuable resource of all. If you found this investigation valuable, if it changed how you think about Ark Raiders' social systems and what they reveal about human nature under pressure, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to LoreEnce. There are more stories buried in the details of game worlds, more questions worth asking about what our entertainment reveals about our anxieties and aspirations and understanding of ourselves. I'll be here in the darkness, pulling at threads, following implications, trying to understand what games are teaching us about who we are and who we might become when circumstances strip away the comfortable assumptions we usually operate under. Until next time, stay safe in your own underground spaces, whatever form they take. Remember that the contradas you belong to, the tribes that give you identity and protection, can also be prisons that prevent you from cooperating with people who share more interests with you than tribal boundaries acknowledge. Remember that the children being raised right now are inheriting a world shaped by choices being made today. And that inheritance includes not just material resources, but social norms and psychological patterns and possibilities or limitations we're establishing through our actions. And remember that even in darkest tunnels, even in most dysfunctional societies, even in circumstances that seem designed to extinguish human flourishing, there are still raiders ascending to the surface, still families forming despite risk, still people choosing cooperation over defection even when defection seems safer. The flame hasn't gone out yet. As long as someone keeps it lit, there's possibility it might eventually illuminate path out of darkness. This is LoreEnce, investigating the worlds we build and the worlds that build us. The extraction continues. The investigation continues. And as long as questions remain about what makes us human and how we maintain humanity under pressure, the work of understanding continues. The underground is listening. Make sure it hears something worth remembering.